The weathered John Deere tractor Robert Walker had driven for 37 harvests made its final journey across the North wheat field at precisely 6:14 a.m. on that October morning, though neither he nor anyone else in Millgrove, Kansas could have imagined that within 12 hours, Governor Sarah Mitchell's security detail would surround his property with enough firepower to secure a small country. The metal door Bob's plow struck wasn't supposed to exist, according to any county record, military archive, or family story passed down through 3 generations of Walkers. Yet there it lay beneath 18 inches of Kansas topsoil, bearing symbols that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of state government and force historians to confront a deliberately buried chapter of American history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun, like countless others on the Walker farm, with Bob rising before dawn to check the moisture levels in the soil. At 68 years of age, his joints protested against the early autumn chill, but farming wasn't just his livelihood. It was encoded in his DNA, passed down from his grandfather, who first broke ground on these 450 acres back in 1952. The financial pressures that had driven most of his neighbors to sell to corporate agricultural giants hadn't broken Bob's resolve, though the stack of overdue notices on his kitchen table told a story of mounting desperation that made this harvest more critical than any before. His daughter Jennifer had driven down from Kansas City the previous evening, her nursing scrubs still bearing the faint antiseptic smell of the hospital where she pulled double shifts to help keep the farm afloat. Her son Kevin, all of 16, and more interested in coding than corn, had reluctantly agreed to help with what they all knew might be the family's final harvest on land that had sustained 3 generations of Walkers. The Harvest Corp Industries offer sat unopened in the kitchen drawer, its presence a constant reminder that the era of family farming in Millgrove was drawing to a close, one foreclosure at a time. Bob had chosen the North Field for this morning's work specifically because it held sentimental value. His father, James, had always insisted this section produced the finest wheat in the county, something about the way the morning sun hit the gentle slope and how the aquifer ran beneath it. As Bob guided the tractor along the familiar rows, he found himself lost in memories of harvests past, of times when farming meant community rather than competition, when neighbors helped neighbors bring in their crops instead of watching vultures from agricultural conglomerates circle overhead. The plow's teeth bit into the earth with practiced precision, turning over soil that had been worked by Walker hands for 7 decades. Bob had made this exact pass thousands of times before, knew every rise and dip in the terrain, could navigate these fields blindfolded if necessary. That's why the sudden metallic shriek that erupted from beneath the plow blade sent an immediate chill down his spine. In 37 years of working this land, he'd never heard that sound. He killed the engine immediately, the sudden silence amplifying the rapid beating of his heart. Climbing down from the tractor's cab with movements made careful by age and surprise, Bob approached the disturbed earth where his plow had carved an unusual furrow. The morning sun caught something metallic, sending reflected light dancing across the wheat stubble. His first thought was an old water pipe, perhaps something from the original irrigation system his grandfather had installed. But as he knelt beside the exposed metal, his calloused fingers brushing away loose soil, he realized this was something else entirely. The metal was wrong. Not the rust-spotted iron or weathered steel common to buried farm equipment, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its surface bearing a strange pattern of symbols that looked almost military in nature. Bob had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He knew government markings when he saw them, but these were different, older somehow, yet surprisingly intact given how long they must have been buried. He spent the next hour carefully excavating around the metal, using hand tools from the tractor's storage box. What emerged challenged everything he thought he knew about his family's land. It wasn't a pipe or forgotten piece of equipment, but a door. A heavy, precisely engineered door set into what appeared to be a concrete frame, measuring roughly 4 feet by 3 feet. The symbols etched into its surface were accompanied by numbers and letters that made no immediate sense. KS 7749 Delta, and below it, in smaller text, Agricultural Defense Initiative 1962. Bob sat back on his heels, his mind racing. 1962. His father would have been running the farm then, just 10 years after establishing it. Why had James Walker never mentioned anything about a buried door, especially one bearing government markings? The Agricultural Defense Initiative meant nothing to Bob, and he'd thought he knew every government program that had touched Kansas farming in the past century. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Jennifer, wondering why he hadn't returned for breakfast. He ignored it, transfixed by his discovery. The door had no visible handle or locking mechanism, just a central panel that seemed designed to accept some kind of key or code. Around its edges, he noticed a series of small holes, evenly spaced, their purpose unclear. The rational part of his mind suggested calling the county office, reporting the find through proper channels, but something held him back. Maybe it was the decades of fighting bureaucracy to keep his farm running, or perhaps simple curiosity about what his father might have been involved with. Whatever the reason, Bob decided to investigate further before alerting anyone else. He retrieved a crowbar from the tractor, working it carefully around the door's edges. To his surprise, after several minutes of effort, he felt something give. A soft hiss escaped from the seal, and the door shifted slightly in its frame. The air that emerged smelled strange. Not stale or musty as he'd expected, but somehow preserved, carrying an odd chemical tang that made him step back instinctively. His phone rang again. This time he answered, if only to buy himself more time. "Dad?" Jennifer's voice carried a mix of concern and irritation. "Where are you? Kevin's already made breakfast." "Northfield," Bob replied, his eyes never leaving the door. "Jenny, did your grandfather ever mention anything about government work, military contracts?" "What? No, why? Dad, what's going on?" "I found something that's been buried out here. Can you and Kevin come out, bring flashlights from the barn?" 20 minutes later, Bob's daughter and grandson stood beside him, staring at the exposed door with expressions that mirrored his own confusion. Kevin, despite his general disinterest in farm life, seemed particularly intrigued by the symbols on the door's surface. "These look like early computer code," the teenager said, kneeling beside the door with his phone out, taking pictures. "Not exactly binary, but something similar. Grandpa, this is seriously cool. It's like something from a spy movie." Jennifer was more practical. "Dad, we should call someone. The sheriff, maybe? This looks official, military even." Bob shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see what's down there first. Could be nothing. Could be an old storm shelter someone forgot about." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Everything about this door screamed purpose, planning, secrecy. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide whatever lay beneath his wheat field, and that someone might very well have been his own father. Working together, they managed to pry the door fully open. A ladder descended into darkness, its rungs showing no signs of rust or decay. Bob went first, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows to reveal a narrow corridor lined with metal. Panels. The walls were painted institutional green, a color he recognized from his military days. The floor was polished concrete, impossibly clean for something that had been sealed for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jennifer and Kevin followed. their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The corridor extended about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. What they found there defied explanation. Banks of equipment lined the walls, some recognizable as early computers, others completely foreign. Glass cases contained what looked like soil samples, seed specimens, and agricultural tools Bob had never seen before. But it was the central feature of the room that made them all stop in their tracks. A massive table dominated the space, its surface covered with documents, maps, and photographs. All of them bore the same Agricultural Defense Initiative stamp Bob had seen on the door. But more shocking than the official markings were the faces in the photographs. Bob recognized them immediately. His father, James Walker, standing alongside men in military uniforms and white lab coats. In several images, they were examining crops, taking measurements, studying charts that seemed to show growth patterns and yield calculations. "Grandpa, look at this," Kevin called from one of the equipment banks. He'd found a logbook, its pages filled with entries in neat handwriting. It's dated 1962 through 1963. Listen to this. Day 47, successful germination of enhanced wheat strain. Growth rate exceeds projections by 300%. Nutritional density increased by 450%. Drought resistance confirmed. Bob took the logbook, flipping through pages that revealed an agricultural project far beyond anything he could have imagined. His father hadn't just been farming. He'd been part of some classified program to develop super crops, enhanced grains that could survive extreme conditions and provide unprecedented nutrition. But why the secrecy? Why hide it beneath the farm? Jennifer found the answer in a folder marked "Classified, Eyes Only." Her face paled as she read. "Dad, this was Cold War stuff. They were developing crops that could survive nuclear fallout, feed populations after atomic warfare. Your father was working with the Department of Defense to create food security in case of nuclear attack." The implications were staggering. Bob's mind raced through decades of memories, searching for any hint that his father had been involved in such work. James Walker had been a quiet man, dedicated to his farm, his family, his community. He'd never spoken of government work, never hinted at secrets buried beneath the soil he tilled. A mechanical whirring suddenly filled the chamber. The equipment, dormant for decades, was coming to life. Lights flickered on panels, screens displayed scrolling data, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. Kevin stepped back from the console he'd been examining, his hands raised. "I didn't touch anything, I swear." But it wasn't Kevin's actions that had triggered the activation. Bob noticed a small sensor near the entrance, its red light now glowing green. Their presence had been detected, logged, reported. To whom he couldn't guess, but the implications made his blood run cold. "We need to leave," he said, gathering the logbook and several folders. "Now." They scrambled back up the ladder, emerging into morning sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the artificial illumination below. Bob's mind was already working through the implications of their discovery. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was active classified material, possibly still monitored by government agencies. His fears were confirmed less than 2 hours later. They had barely finished a hurried breakfast. The stolen documents spread across the kitchen table when the first black SUVs appeared on the country road leading to their farm. Not local law enforcement, but vehicles bearing state government plates. Within minutes, the farm was surrounded by serious-looking individuals in dark suits, their earpieces and concealed weapons marking them as security personnel. Sheriff Dan Morrison's cruiser arrived shortly after, the local lawman looking as confused as Bob felt. "Bob!" the sheriff called out, approaching the farmhouse with his hands visible and empty. "I've got Director Thomas Grant here from Topeka. Says there's been a security breach on your property. Mind if we talk?" Director Grant stepped forward, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the scene. Mr. Walker, we understand you've made a discovery this morning, something that falls under state security protocols. We're going to need to secure the area and discuss what you found. Bob stood on his porch, his family behind him, watching as more vehicles arrived. Official-looking people with equipment cases began setting up a perimeter around the north field. Whatever his father had been involved with, whatever secrets lay beneath his farm, the quiet morning harvest had unleashed something that couldn't be contained. The realization hit him with crystalline clarity. His family's financial struggles, the threat of losing the farm, even this final harvest had suddenly become secondary to a mystery that reached back through decades of deliberately hidden history. The metal door in his wheat field hadn't just opened access to a secret bunker. It had unlocked questions about his father's life, his family's role in a classified government program, and agricultural secrets that someone, somewhere, still considered important enough to guard. As Director Grant approached the porch, his aide already on the phone with what sounded like the governor's office, Bob knew his life as a simple Kansas farmer had irrevocably changed. The question now wasn't whether he'd lose his farm to foreclosure, but whether he'd just stumbled onto something that powerful people had spent decades keeping buried. The morning sun climbed higher in the October sky, casting long shadows across the Walker farm as government personnel established their containment zone. Whatever lay ahead, Bob understood that his discovery had set in motion events that would reshape not just his family's future, but potentially reveal truths about American agriculture that had been classified for over half a century. In the distance, he could hear the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors approaching. The quiet Kansas morning was about to become anything but quiet, and the last harvest Bob Walker had planned would be remembered for something far more significant than bringing in the wheat. The metal door had opened more than just access to a buried facility. It had unlocked secrets that powerful people had believed would remain hidden forever, and Bob Walker, a simple farmer fighting to save his land, had just become the keeper of those secrets, whether he wanted to be or not. The adventure that began with a routine morning of plowing would soon reveal connections to Cold War history, revolutionary agricultural science, and family secrets that would challenge everything Bob thought he knew about his heritage. But first, he had to face Director Grant and explain how a Kansas farmer had accidentally uncovered one of the state's most closely guarded classified programs. The financial weight crushing the Walker family had been building for years, but the morning Bob discovered the metal door, their situation had reached a critical breaking point. The yellow envelope from First Prairie Bank lay unopened on the kitchen counter, its contents already known to everyone in the household. Final notice. 30 days to pay the outstanding balance of $127,000 or face foreclosure proceedings on land that had been in the family since Dwight Eisenhower was president. Bob's calloused hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee into his father's old mug, the one with the faded "World's Best Dad" inscription that Jennifer had given him 20 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. Some father he'd turned out to be, unable to provide his daughter with the inheritance that should have been her birthright. Jennifer sat across from him at the worn oak table, dark circles under her eyes from another. Double shift at Mercy General Hospital in Kansas City. "Dad, I can take out another loan against my 401k, Jennifer offered, though they both knew her retirement account had already been drained to keep the farm operational through the previous season's drought. At 42, she should have been planning for her own future, not sacrificing it to prop up a failing agricultural legacy. Kevin looked up from his laptop, where he'd been researching commodity prices and yield projections. The teenager's natural aptitude for technology had led him to create complex spreadsheets, tracking their financial decline with depressing accuracy. Even if we bring in a perfect harvest, grain prices are down 18% from last year. We'd need a miracle to cover half the debt. Gee, The miracle Bob had prayed for during countless sleepless nights hadn't involved metal doors or buried secrets. He'd imagined rain at the perfect moments, grain prices suddenly spiking, or perhaps an unexpected inheritance from some forgotten relative. Instead, he'd spent the pre-dawn hours of what might be his last harvest walking through fields his grandfather had first planted, trying to memorize every furrow and fence line before Harvest Corp Industries transformed it all into another industrial agricultural operation. 3 farms in Millgrove had already fallen to the corporation this year: the Hendersons, the Morettis, and just last month, the Yangs, whose family had worked their land for even longer than the Walkers. Bob had attended each auction, watching. Neighbors bid farewell to their heritage, while corporate representatives calculated profit margins on tablets that cost more than most farmers made in a month. The community fabric of Millgrove was unraveling thread by thread, and Bob knew his farm would be the next strand to break. His wife Margaret's medical bills from her final battle with cancer had started the downward spiral 5 years ago. Insurance covered some costs, but experimental treatments and extended hospital stays had required second mortgages, equipment loans, and eventually the liquidation of every asset not directly tied to farming operations. Bob had sold the antique tractors his father had collected, Margaret's grandmother's jewelry, even the mineral rights to the back 40 acres. Each sale had bought time, but deepened the hole they couldn't climb out of. The breakfast Jennifer had prepared sat largely untouched. Scrambled eggs from their few remaining hens, toast made from store-bought bread because they'd sold the wheat that would have gone to the local mill, and coffee that Bob suddenly realized might be the last. Pot brewed in this kitchen by Walker hands. The mundane had become precious, each familiar routine now weighted with impending loss. Frank Torres, their nearest neighbor and Bob's closest friend since high school, had stopped by the previous evening with a 6-pack of beer and unspoken sympathy. They'd sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold, neither man acknowledging that this might be their last such evening together. Frank's own farm was barely hanging on, sustained only by his son's income from a tech job in Omaha. The agricultural community that had once defined Millgrove was aging out, dying off, or being bought out, leaving behind empty houses and fallow fields that corporate operations would soon convert to monoculture production. "Maybe it's time," Bob had said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. "Maybe we're just postponing the inevitable. Harvest Corp's offering enough to pay off the debts and leave something for Jenny and Kevin." Frank had taken a long pull from his beer before responding. "Your daddy never would have sold, Bob, neither would mine. But they lived in different times. The game's rigged now, and fellows like us, we're playing with yesterday's rules." The truth in those words had kept Bob awake most of the night. He'd risen at 4:30, unable to bear the silence of the house any longer. His morning walk through the fields had been a goodbye tour, touching fence posts his father had set, examining soil his grandfather had first turned, trying to imprint every detail in his memory before strangers took possession of his family's legacy. The kitchen phone rang, startling them all. Jennifer answered, her expression shifting from concern to confusion as she listened. "It's someone from the state agricultural department," she said, covering the mouthpiece. "They're asking about historical land records for our property." Bob frowned, taking the phone. The voice on the other end was professionally pleasant, but oddly urgent. "Mr. Walker, this is Patricia Reeves from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. We're updating our historical databases and noticed some discrepancies in the records for your property. Specifically, there are references to federal agricultural programs from the early 1960s that seem to have been classified. Would you happen to have any family documents from that period?" The question seemed absurdly timed, given their current crisis. "Dr. Reeves, I appreciate your interest in historical accuracy, but we're in the middle of what might be our last harvest. Whatever programs my father might have participated in 60 years ago don't really concern me right now. I understand, Mr. Walker, and I apologize for the timing. It's just that these programs, well, they involved significant federal investment and some rather unusual agricultural initiatives. There might be considerations that affect your current situation. Something in her tone made Bob pause. What kind of considerations? I'd prefer not to discuss details over the phone. Would it be possible for me to visit your farm today? I could be there within 2 hours. Bob glanced at his family, seeing his own confusion reflected in their faces. We'll be here, he said finally. Though I can't imagine what could be so important about ancient history right now. After hanging up, he found Jennifer and Kevin staring at him with questioning expressions. State Agricultural Department, he explained. Something about historical records and federal programs from the 60s. Probably just bureaucratic housekeeping. But even as he said it, something nagged at the back of his mind. His father had been oddly secretive about certain aspects of the farm's early years. There had been periods when James Walker would disappear, for days at a time, returning with vague explanations about agricultural meetings or government consultations. Bob had been a teenager then, more interested in cars and girls than his father's business dealings. The morning routine continued, but with an undercurrent of tension. Kevin returned to his laptop, now researching historical federal agricultural programs. Jennifer busied herself with cleaning dishes while stealing glances at the foreclosure. Notice. Bob found himself drawn to the old filing cabinet in his father's former office, searching for any documents that might explain Dr. Reeves's cryptic interest. Most of the papers were mundane: seed receipts, equipment purchases, tax records, dating back decades. But in a drawer he rarely opened, Bob found a manila folder marked simply 1962-63. Inside were carbon copies of letters his father had written to various government departments, all referencing something called Project Greenfield and making oblique references to special cultivation requirements and security protocols. One letter, addressed to someone at the Department of Defense, caught his attention. The isolation of the North Field continues to serve our purposes well. Local community remains unaware of the specialized nature of our work here. Request permission to expand testing to sections 7 and 8, as discussed in our last meeting. Department of Defense. Bob's father had been a farmer, not a military contractor. What possible interest could the Pentagon have had in a Kansas wheat field in 1962? The Cold War had been at its height then, with the Cuban Missile Crisis fresh in everyone's mind. But agricultural testing seemed far removed from nuclear standoffs and international intrigue. His contemplation was interrupted by Kevin's excited voice from the kitchen. "Grandpa, you need to see this. I found something about Project Greenfield online. It's all redacted government documents, but there are references to agricultural, hardening and post-event food security. What does that even mean?" Before Bob could respond, the distinct sound of vehicle engines drew their attention to the window. Not the single car they'd expected from Dr. Reeves, but a convoy of 3 black SUVs and what looked like a mobile command unit. They moved with military precision, taking positions around the farmhouse with practiced efficiency. "Dad," Jennifer said quietly, her voice tight with concern, "I don't think this is about historical records." Bob felt his chest tighten as he watched uniformed personnel emerge from the vehicles. Whatever his father had been involved with 6 decades ago suddenly felt very present, very real, and very much beyond the scope of a simple farming family's understanding. The financial crisis that had consumed his thoughts for months abruptly seemed less important than whatever was about to unfold. The lead SUV's door opened, and a woman in a crisp business suit stepped out, flanked by two serious-looking men in dark suits. Even from a distance, Bob could see the badge hanging from her neck, the kind that granted access to places ordinary citizens never saw. Dr. Patricia Reeves, if that's who she really was, clearly represented more than the state agricultural department. As the entourage approached his front door, Bob realized that his morning's plan to begin what might be his last harvest had just become complicated by shadows from a past he'd never known existed. The Walker family farm, teetering on the edge of foreclosure, had somehow become the focus of government attention that suggested his father's legacy involved far more than soil and seeds. The doorbell rang, its familiar chime now ominous in the tense atmosphere. Bob looked at his daughter and grandson, seeing his own apprehension mirrored in their faces. Whatever was about to happen, whatever secrets his father had kept, they were about to learn that the Walker farm's history held more than just agricultural records. The question was whether those secrets would save them or bury them deeper than any financial crisis ever could. Jennifer squeezed his shoulder as he moved toward the door. "Together, Dad. Whatever this is, we face it together." Bob nodded, drawing strength from his daughter's presence. The family that had weathered drought, disease, and death was about to confront something potentially more challenging: the truth about their own history. He reached for the doorknob, knowing that opening this door would likely close forever. His simple understanding of who his father had been and what legacy had really been left beneath the Kansas soil. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. In a few moments, those shadows would be joined by others, shadows of a past that had remained buried for 60 years, but was about to resurface with implications that none of them could yet imagine. The Walker family's financial crisis had inadvertently awakened something much larger, and as Bob turned the doorknob, he couldn't shake the feeling that their desperate situation had somehow been inevitable, orchestrated by forces and plans set in motion before he was even born. The door opened, and with it, a new chapter in the Walker family story began. One that would reveal that their struggles to save the farm were merely the surface layer of a much deeper, more complex inheritance that James Walker had left for future generations to discover when the time was right. And apparently, that time had arrived on this crisp October morning, disguised as just another day in their fight for financial survival. As Dr. Reeves stepped across the threshold, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes sharp with purpose, Bob couldn't help but wonder if his father had somehow known this day would come. Had James Walker planted more than just wheat in that north field? Had he buried secrets that would outlast any crop, any season, any financial crisis? The answers, it seemed, were about to be unearthed, whether the current generation of Walkers was ready for them or not. The old farmhouse, which had sheltered 4 generations of Walkers, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a stage where some carefully orchestrated drama was about to unfold. And Bob, who had thought his biggest challenge was saving his farm from foreclosure, was about to discover that his family's story was far more complex than anyone in Millgrove had ever imagined. The financial desperation that had driven him to that north field this morning now seemed less like misfortune and more like destiny, a predetermined path that would lead to revelations his father had spent decades protecting. Outside, more. Vehicles continued to arrive, their occupants moving with purpose around the property's perimeter. Whatever Bob had expected from this day, it wasn't this. The last harvest he'd planned might indeed be his last, but not for the reasons he'd imagined. Something larger than bankruptcy, larger than corporate takeovers, larger than the death of family farming had been set in motion, and the Walker family stood at its center, inadvertent inheritors of secrets that apparently still mattered too. People with the power to mobilize government resources at a moment's notice. The decision that would change everything came to Bob Walker as he stood in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at the north field through his bedroom window. Sleep had eluded him entirely, his mind churning through the impossibilities of their situation. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed, 4:47 a.m., its red numbers counting down the hours until the bank would expect another payment they couldn't make. In the kitchen below, he could hear Jennifer moving quietly, probably unable to sleep either, making coffee for another day of wrestling with numbers that refused to add up to salvation. The north field stretched out before him in the October moonlight, its unharvested wheat swaying gently in the cool morning breeze. His father had always treated that section differently, insisting on specific planting schedules, refusing to rotate crops there like modern farming practices demanded. Some traditions run deeper than convenience, James Walker had said whenever. Bob questioned the old ways. Now, with foreclosure looming and every acre crucial to their survival, Bob found himself staring at that field with a mixture of resentment and desperation. He dressed quietly, pulling on work clothes worn soft by decades of use. The floorboards creaked familiarly under his feet as he made his way downstairs, each sound a reminder of the generations who had walked these same boards before him. The house itself seemed to exhale history with every settling beam and groaning. Joist, 4 generations of Walker dreams and struggles embedded in its very foundation. Jennifer looked up as he entered the kitchen, her face drawn with exhaustion. Couldn't sleep either. She pushed a mug of coffee across the table toward him, the steam rising like morning fog over the fields. That north field, Bob said without preamble. I'm going to plow it under this morning, start fresh. Maybe if we can get winter wheat in early enough. His daughter's expression shifted to surprise. Dad, you've never touched that field. Even during the worst drought years, you left it alone, said Grandpa made you promise. The promise. Bob remembered that conversation with painful clarity now. His father, dying of emphysema in the hospital, had gripped his hand with surprising strength. The north field stays as it is, James had wheezed. No deep plowing, no heavy equipment. Promise me, Robert. Some things are more important than profit. But that was before the cascade of disasters that had brought them to this point. Before Margaret's cancer, before the medical bills, before the equipment failures and crop diseases that had steadily eroded their financial foundation. His father had never faced the choice between tradition and survival, had never watched vultures from agricultural corporations circle his dying farm. Promises to the dead don't pay living bills, Bob said, the words tasting bitter even as he spoke them. We need every bushel we can produce. That field has been underutilized for decades. It's time to modernize, use it properly. Kevin stumbled into the kitchen, still half asleep but drawn by the unusual early morning conversation. At 16, he'd already witnessed more family financial discussions than most kids his age, had learned to read the worry in adult faces with disturbing accuracy. What's happening? He asked, pouring himself juice with the casual assumption of youth that there would always be juice in the refrigerator, always be a refrigerator, always be a kitchen to put it in. Jennifer explained while Bob stared into his coffee cup, seeing not the dark liquid, but years of deferred maintenance, delayed dreams, and desperate measures reflected in its surface. The north field represented almost 40 acres of potentially productive land, enough to make a significant difference in their yield if properly utilized. But why did Great-Grandpa care so much about that field? Kevin asked, his natural curiosity awakened despite the early hour. I mean, dirt is dirt, right? What makes that section special? The question hung in the air as Bob tried to formulate an answer. The truth was, he didn't know. His father had been notably vague about many things, especially regarding the farm's early years. There had always been an element of mystery about how James Walker, son of a factory worker, had acquired prime Kansas farmland in the early 1950s. The official story involved savings and a favorable loan, but the numbers had never quite added up, even accounting for lower land prices in that era. Sometimes old farmers get sentimental about particular sections, Bob said finally. Maybe it was where he proposed to your grandmother or where he first broke ground. The reasons don't matter anymore. What matters is survival. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. His father hadn't been given to sentimentality. James Walker had been practical to a fault, a man who calculated seed density and fertilizer ratios with mathematical precision. If he'd insisted on leaving the North Field alone, there had been a reason beyond mere emotion. The kitchen window faced east, and the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the horizon. Bob made his decision with the finality of a man who had run out of options. I'm going out there now. The old John Deere should be able to handle that ground. If we work fast, we might salvage something from this season yet. Jennifer and Kevin exchanged glances, a silent communication that spoke of shared concern. Dad, Jennifer started, but Bob was already heading for the door, his coffee abandoned on the table. We'll come with you, Kevin offered, surprising everyone, including himself. The teenager had shown little interest in farm work, preferring his computer to combines, but something about this morning felt different, significant in ways none of them could articulate. The walk to the equipment barn was familiar, yet strange in the pre-dawn light. Frost crunched under their boots, and their breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The old John Deere sat in its usual spot, a 1970s model that Bob had maintained, with religious devotion because newer equipment was beyond their means. He ran his hand along its faded green paint, feeling the small dents and scratches that mapped its history of service to the Walker farm. You sure about this, Dad? Jennifer asked as Bob climbed into the driver's seat. The question carried weight beyond its simple words, encompassing not just the immediate decision, but the breaking of a generational promise. Bob's hand hesitated on the ignition key. 3 generations of Walkers had honored his father's strange prohibition against disturbing the North Field. His grandfather had established the farm. His father had built it into something substantial, and Bob had, presided over its decline, failed to adapt to modern agricultural realities, or had he been a faithful steward of something he didn't understand? The engine turned over on the 3rd try, its familiar rumble drowning out his doubts. Kevin climbed up beside him while Jennifer stood back, her arms crossed against the morning chill and perhaps against the decision itself. The plow attachment had been serviced just last week, its blades sharpened and ready for work they couldn't afford to delay any longer. The drive to the North Field took only minutes, but felt like a journey across years. Bob's mind filled with memories, his father teaching him to drive this very tractor, walking these fields as a boy, learning to read the sky for weather, the soil for moisture, the plants for disease. Every fence post they passed had been set by Walker hands, every furrow carved by Walker determination. The North Field came into view as they crested a small rise. 40 acres of wheat stubble and volunteer growth, oddly isolated from the rest of the farm's operations by a buffer of uncultivated land. Bob had always found it strange that his father had insisted on this separation, maintaining what amounted to a barrier zone around that particular section. He positioned the tractor at the field's edge, lowering the plow until its blades bit into the earth. The moment felt weighted with significance, like standing at the threshold of an irreversible decision. Once he began, there would be no stopping, no way to undo whatever changes the deep plowing would bring. Last chance to reconsider, Kevin said quietly, his young face unusually serious in the growing light. Maybe there's another way. Maybe we don't have to. There is no other way, Bob cut him off, but gently. We've tried everything else, sold everything that wasn't essential, borrowed against everything that was. This field is our last card. To play. He engaged the plow and pressed the accelerator. The tractor lurched forward, its blade cutting deep into soil that hadn't been truly disturbed in 60 years. The earth turned over in dark ribbons behind them, revealing soil that looked somehow different from the surrounding fields, darker, richer, with an odd consistency that made Bob frown. They had completed barely 3 passes when the plow hit something solid. The impact jarred the entire tractor, sending a metallic shriek through the morning air that sent roosting birds exploding from nearby trees. Bob immediately killed the engine, his heart racing as he climbed down to investigate. "What was that?" Kevin asked, following close behind. "Buried rock." But as they approached the point of impact, it became clear they hadn't hit a rock. The plow had scraped across something metallic, exposing what appeared to be a deliberately placed structure. Bob knelt in the freshly turned soil, brushing dirt away with hands that trembled slightly. Metal emerged, not rusty farm equipment or forgotten infrastructure, but something that gleamed dully despite its underground burial. Jennifer had driven out in the farm truck, arriving just as Bob exposed more of the metal surface. She joined them at the excavation site, her expression shifting from concern to amazement as the scope of their discovery became apparent. This wasn't random debris. This was something constructed, engineered, placed here with purpose and precision. "It's a door," Kevin breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a door buried in our field." Indeed, as they cleared more soil, the outline of what was unmistakably an access hatch emerged. Heavy-duty metal, perhaps 4 feet by 3 feet, set into what appeared to be a concrete frame. But it was the markings on the door's surface that made them all step back in surprise. Military-style stenciling proclaimed KS 7749 Delta alongside the words Agricultural Defense Initiative, 1962. Bob stared at the markings, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 1962, the year his father had taken over full operation of the farm, the year James Walker had become notably secretive about certain aspects of the business, the year that, according to the few records Bob had found, significant improvements had been made to the property. Agricultural Defense Initiative, Jennifer read aloud. "Dad, what is this? What was Grandpa involved in?" The morning sun was fully up now, casting sharp shadows across their discovery. Bob found himself thinking about his father's deathbed insistence on leaving this field untouched. Not sentiment then, not tradition, but secrecy. James Walker had known what lay beneath this soil and had spent decades protecting it, ensuring it remained hidden. "I don't know," Bob admitted, running his fingers across the raised lettering on the door. "But whatever it is, it's been here. All along, whatever Grandpa was protecting, we just found it." Kevin was already taking photos with his phone, his excitement palpable. "This is like something out of a movie. Secret government bunkers in Kansas. Do you think it's from the Cold War? Some kind of fallout shelter?" But Bob's attention was drawn to smaller text etched near the door's locking mechanism. "Access restricted to authorized personnel. Project Greenfield Classification Level Sigma." His blood chilled. He'd spent 2 years in Vietnam, had worked briefly with classified materials. Sigma was serious. The kind of classification that didn't get declassified after a few decades. "We need to be very careful here," he said slowly. "This isn't just some forgotten storm cellar. This is something else." The financial desperation that had driven him to break his promise to his father suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what they'd uncovered. Whatever lay behind this door had been important enough to hide, important enough to protect for 6 decades, important enough for his father to extract a deathbed promise to leave it undisturbed. Jennifer voiced what they were all thinking. Should we call someone? The police? The government? But even as she spoke, Bob was examining the door more closely. Unlike what he'd expect from a 60-year-old installation, the metal showed no signs of corrosion. The locking mechanism, while clearly dated in design, appeared to be in perfect working order. Someone had built this to last, had engineered it to withstand decades of burial without degradation. Not yet, he decided. Let's understand what we're dealing with first. Kevin, go get the toolbox from the truck and the big flashlights from the barn. If we're going to open this, we need to see what's inside. As his grandson ran off on the errand, Bob found himself wondering if his father had ever intended for this moment to come. Had James Walker expected his promise to hold forever? Or had he known that eventually circumstances would force his descendants to make the very decision Bob had made this morning? The morning breeze picked up, stirring the wheat stubble around them. In the distance, Bob could see the familiar outline of the farmhouse, the barns, the life he'd known for 68 years. But here, in this field, his father had protected with such determination, he sensed he was standing at the threshold of something that would render all their financial worries irrelevant. Whatever the Agricultural Defense Initiative had been, whatever Project Greenfield had involved, the secrets buried beneath their North Field were about to be exposed to the light of a new century. And Bob Walker, who had thought he was just trying to save his farm, was about to discover that his family's legacy involved far more than acres and yields. The plow sat abandoned behind them, its blades still dirty with the soil it had turned. The decision to break his father's prohibition had led to this moment, this discovery, this threshold between the known and unknown. As Kevin returned with the tools, as Jennifer documented everything with her phone camera, Bob knew there was no going back. The door was here, real, waiting, and despite every instinct warning him against it, he knew they were going to open it. The morning had begun with a desperate farmer's decision to maximize his land use. It would continue with that same farmer becoming an explorer of his own family's hidden history. The North Field, protected for so long, was about to yield a harvest. Very different from any crop the Walkers had ever grown. And Bob, standing in the morning sun with dirt on his hands and questions in his mind, was about to learn why his father had been so insistent that some ground should never be disturbed. The metal door beckoned, its secrets pressing against 6 decades of silence. Whatever lay beyond it had been patient, waiting for this moment, this family, this desperate decision that had finally brought the past crashing into the present. Bob gripped the tools tighter, took a deep breath, and prepared to discover what James Walker had spent a lifetime protecting. The metallic screech when Bob's plow struck the hidden door had been jarring enough, but what followed immediately after sent chills down his spine that had nothing to do with the October morning cold. As the echo of metal on metal faded across the North Field, a soft mechanical hum began emanating from beneath the soil, so faint at first that Bob thought he might be imagining it. The sound grew steadily, accompanied by an almost imperceptible vibration that he could feel through the soles of his worn work boots. Kevin noticed it too, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the tractor's large rear tire. "Grandpa, do you hear that? Feel that? It's like something just woke up down there." Bob held up his hand for silence, straining to understand what they'd triggered. The hum had a rhythm to it, almost like breathing, or perhaps the cycling of some long-dormant machinery coming back to life. After 40 years of farming this land, he knew every sound it could make. The whisper of wind through wheat, the settling of soil after rain, the scurrying of field mice in the stubble. This was entirely foreign, entirely wrong. Jennifer had parked the farm truck at the field's edge and was jogging toward them, her face creased with concern. "What happened? I heard that sound from the house. It was like a giant tuning fork being struck." Before Bob could answer, the exposed portion of the metal door began to change. What had appeared to be simple weathered steel started showing signs of activity. Tiny lights, no bigger than pinpricks, began glowing along the edges of the visible surface. They pulsed in sequence, creating patterns that seemed almost like a code or language. "Holy shit," Kevin breathed, then immediately apologized for his language. But Bob barely heard him. His attention was fixed on those lights, on the impossible fact that something buried for 60 years was showing signs of active electronics. No battery could last that long. No electrical system from 1962 should still be functional after decades underground. The humming intensified, and suddenly a section of the door they hadn't even fully uncovered yet began to rise slightly from its frame, not opening but adjusting, as if calibrating itself. Soil that had accumulated in the seams fell away, revealing more of the door's surface. The metal wasn't uniform. There were panels, interfaces, what looked like sensors or scanning equipment integrated into its structure. "Dad, we need to call someone," Jennifer said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and awe. "This isn't just some old bunker. I don't know what this is." Bob found himself stepping backward, his lifetime of rational farming experience warring with what his eyes were showing him. The door wasn't just a barrier. It was a mechanism, a piece of technology that defied explanation, and they had activated it with nothing more than an accidental collision with a 60-year-old plow blade. Kevin, displaying the fearlessness of youth, moved closer to examine the lights. "These patterns aren't random," he announced, his face illuminated by the pulsing glow. "Look, they repeat every 30 seconds or so. It's definitely a sequence, maybe a startup routine." "Get back from there," Bob ordered, his protective instincts overriding his curiosity. "We don't know what we're dealing with." But even as he spoke, more changes were occurring. A seam appeared in what they had thought was solid metal, outlining a smaller panel within the main door. This panel slid aside with precision engineering, revealing what could only be described as an interface. Buttons, switches, and what appeared to be some kind of display screen, all protected behind a clear material that showed no signs of age or weathering. The screen flickered to life, displaying text that made Bob's blood run cold. Activation sequence initiated. Await authentication. Time elapsed since last access. 22,654 days. Jennifer did the math faster than the others. That's 62 years, almost exactly. She looked at her father with wide eyes. Someone accessed this thing the year it was built, and then nothing. The display changed, now showing what appeared to be a schematic of the surrounding area. Bob recognized the layout immediately. It was their farm, but as it had existed in the early 1960s. Buildings that had been torn down decades ago appeared on the screen. Field boundaries that had been changed, even trees that had long since been removed. But most disturbing was the overlay of red lines crisscrossing the property, converging on multiple points, including the exact spot where they now stood. "Surface intrusion detected," the screen announced in glowing letters. "Protocol 7 engaged, identifying genetic markers." A beam of pale blue light suddenly emanated from a previously invisible lens in the door's surface, sweeping across all three of them. Bob felt a strange, tingling sensation as it passed over him, like static electricity, but somehow more invasive. The light lingered longest on him, pulsing as if taking some kind of reading. Walker genetic signature confirmed. Generational match, third, authorization pending. "Genetic signature?" Kevin whispered. "It knows who we are? How is that possible?" Bob's mind raced. His father had been involved in something that included genetic recognition technology in 1962. That was decades ahead of anything that should have existed. What kind of project had required such advanced security measures? And why hide it beneath a Kansas wheat field? The mechanical sounds beneath their feet changed pitch, becoming more urgent, The ground around the door began to shift, not violently but with purpose. Soil fell away from a much larger area, revealing that what they'd thought was a simple access hatch was actually part of a considerably more extensive installation. Metal panels extended outward from the central door, forming what looked like a landing platform or staging area approximately 10 feet square. Jennifer grabbed Bob's arm. "Dad, we should leave, now. This is way beyond anything we should be involved with. Whatever Grandpa was part of, it's not our problem." But even as she spoke, the screen displayed new text. "Emergency protocols active. Threat assessment critical. Agricultural defense systems online, awaiting Walker authorization for full access." Agricultural defense systems. The same words that had been stenciled on the door, but what did they mean? What could possibly need defending in agriculture that required this level of technology and secrecy? The humming reached a crescendo, and then suddenly silence. The kind of deep, unnatural silence that made the normal sounds of the morning, birds, wind, distant traffic on the county road, seem muffled and far away. The air itself felt different, charged with potential energy. "Temporal stasis field established," the screen announced. "Immediate area secured, awaiting command authorization." Kevin pulled out his phone, presumably to record what was happening, but frowned at the screen. No signal, and that's weird. The clock is frozen, so is everything else. None of the apps are updating. Bob looked at his own watch, a mechanical model that had belonged to his father. The second hand had stopped moving, yet he could still move, still think, still breathe. Whatever this temporal stasis field was, it seemed selective in its effects. The interface panel reconfigured itself, presenting what appeared to be a palm reader surrounded by various lights and indicators. Above it, text appeared, "Place hand on biometric scanner for identity verification. Walker, Robert James, born March 15th, 1956, son of Walker, James Theodore. Genetic authorization level. Hereditary access." It knew him. Knew his birthday, his father's name, details that no computer system from 1962 should have been able to process or store. Bob stared at the palm reader, its surface gleaming with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his accelerated heartbeat. "Don't do it, Dad," Jennifer pleaded. "We don't know what this is. What if it's dangerous? What if it's some kind of weapon?" But Bob found himself moving forward despite her concerns. Something deep in his gut, perhaps the same instinct that had driven him to plow this field against his father's wishes, told him this was inevitable. Whatever James Walker had hidden here, it had been waiting specifically for this moment, for a Walker descendant to discover it, to make a choice. "It knows us," he said quietly. "It's been waiting for us, for me specifically. Third generation, that's what it said. Grandpa built this, Dad protected it, and now it's your turn," Kevin finished, his young face showing understanding beyond his years. "Whatever this is, it's family. It's ours." The morning sun seemed to dim as Bob approached the interface, though whether that was due to the mysterious field effects or his own tunneled vision, he couldn't tell. The palm reader glowed more brightly as he neared, as if sensing his approach. Around them, the very air seemed to hold its breath. Bob raised his weathered hand, pausing just inches from the scanning surface. In that moment, he thought about all the times his father had walked this field, had carefully maintained the buffer zone around it, had insisted on its special treatment. James Walker hadn't just been keeping a promise to his own father. He'd been guarding something that required a Walker's touch to access. "Awaiting biometric confirmation," the screen prompted. "Warning, once initiated, full activation sequence. Cannot be reversed. Historical protocols will be superseded. Confirm intent to proceed." The weight of generational responsibility pressed down on Bob's shoulders. His father had chosen to keep this buried, to honor whatever agreement had been. made in 1962, but times had changed. The farm faced foreclosure. The world faced challenges that couldn't have been imagined 60 years ago. And perhaps most importantly, the technology itself seemed to have decided it was time to emerge. "Whatever happens," Bob said, looking back at his daughter and grandson, "we face it together, as a family." He pressed his palm against the scanner. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The moment his skin made contact with the surface, Bob felt a surge of energy run up his arm and throughout his body. Not painful, but intense, like every cell was being catalogued and verified. The scanner's surface wasn't cold as he'd expected, but warm, almost alive. Genetic match confirmed. Walker family line authenticated. Generational protocol satisfied. The mechanical voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, Robert James Walker. Your grandfather's legacy awaits." The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, not violently, but with the purposeful movement of massive machinery coming to life after decades of dormancy. The exposed metal platform expanded further, revealing an entrance that had been completely hidden moments before. Stairs descended into darkness, but as Bob watched, lights began to activate along the stairwell's walls, beckoning them downward. Surface conditions evaluated, the system continued. Threat level assessment, critical, economic pressure on family unit, severe, agricultural crisis. Indicators present, initiating revelation protocol as per contingency planning. Bob stepped back from the scanner, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. The system hadn't just verified his identity. It had somehow assessed their current situation, had understood their financial crisis, had made a decision based on parameters his grandfather had established over 6 decades ago. Jennifer moved to his side, her fear replaced by wonder. "It knows about the foreclosure? About our situation? How is that possible?" James Theodore Walker established monitoring protocols in 1963, the system explained, apparently able to hear and respond to their questions. Continuous observation of family status, economic conditions, and global agricultural indicators has been maintained. Threshold conditions for revelation have been met. Kevin was already moving toward the stairs, his curiosity overcoming caution. "It's been watching us all this time." Protection of the Walker legacy required ongoing assessment. Your grandfather's instructions were specific. Reveal only when the family's need coincides with humanity's requirement. Both conditions are now satisfied. The implications staggered Bob. His grandfather hadn't just hidden something. He'd created a system that had been evaluating conditions for over half a century, waiting for the precise moment when whatever lay below should be revealed. The financial crisis that had driven Bob to break his promise hadn't been a violation of his grandfather's wishes. It had been the trigger his grandfather had anticipated. "Descent is now authorized," the system announced. "Automated guide protocols are active. The Agricultural Defense Initiative awaits your inspection. Prepare for paradigm adjustment." The 3 walkers stood at the top of the illuminated stairway, 3 generations united by circumstance and mystery. Below them lay answers to questions they hadn't known to ask, solutions to problems they'd thought insurmountable, and secrets that had been kept for reasons they were about to understand. Bob took a deep breath, thinking of his father's deathbed words. Not a plea to keep the land untouched, he now realized, but perhaps a prayer that the right conditions would never arise, that the family would never be desperate enough to trigger whatever his own father had put in place. But James Walker had also known that if those conditions did arise, his son would do what was necessary. "Together," Bob said, echoing his daughter's earlier words. He took the first step down, feeling the weight of family history and the pull of an unknown future with each footfall. Jennifer followed, then Kevin, their feet finding purchase on stairs that showed no sign of 6 decades abandonment. As they descended, the entrance above them remained open, but the strange field effects continued. The morning sun still shone, but time itself seemed suspended, waiting for the walkers to discover what had been so carefully preserved beneath their land. The familiar world of struggling farms and corporate buyouts, of mortgage payments and crop yields, suddenly seemed very far away. The stairs continued downward, deeper than any normal basement or storm shelter would require. The walls were smooth, constructed of materials that looked more like the inside of a spacecraft than an agricultural facility. Lights activated ahead of them and dimmed behind, creating a bubble of illumination that moved with their progress. Sub-level 1 approaching, the system announced. Historical Archive and Orientation Center. Please proceed to Briefing Room Alpha for initial disclosure. Whatever the Agricultural Defense Initiative was, whatever Bob's grandfather had helped create and his father had protected, it was about to be revealed. The morning that had begun with a desperate decision to plow a protected field had become something else entirely, a homecoming to a legacy the walkers had never known they possessed. The last step brought them to a corridor that stretched away into the darkness, its scale suggesting a facility far larger than anything that should exist beneath a Kansas farm. As they stepped off the stairs, more lights activated, revealing doors marked with cryptic designations and symbols that seemed both military and scientific in nature. Bob paused, looking back up the stairway at the square of morning sky visible at the top. That was the world he knew. The struggling farm, the mounting debts, the corporate threats. Down here was something else entirely, something his grandfather had believed important enough to hide, protect, and monitor for over 60 years. "Well," he said, his voice steady despite the unreality of their situation, "let's find out what Grandpa left us." They walked forward into the corridor, 3 generations of walkers about to discover that their family's agricultural legacy extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. The door they'd uncovered had been just the beginning. What lay ahead would challenge everything they thought they knew about their history, their purpose, and quite possibly the future of agriculture itself. Behind them, the entrance remained open, a portal between the world they knew and the one they were about to discover. And somewhere in the depths of the facility, systems that had waited patiently for 6 decades prepared to reveal secrets that would transform not just the Walker family's fate, but potentially the fate of a world facing agricultural challenges that Bob's grandfather had somehow anticipated. The morning's desperate decision had become an appointment with destiny, and the walkers were about to learn that sometimes breaking a promise is exactly what keeping faith requires. The first thing that struck Bob Walker as they descended into the illuminated corridor was the absolute silence. Not the quiet of an abandoned space, but the engineered stillness of a place designed to eliminate all ambient noise. The air itself felt different, processed through systems that had somehow remained operational for 6 decades without any apparent maintenance or external power source. Each breath carried a subtle charge, as if the oxygen had been enhanced, in ways his lungs recognized, but his mind couldn't comprehend. The corridor stretched before them like a throat swallowing them into the Earth's secrets. Unlike the rough-hewn tunnels Bob might have expected from 1960s construction, these walls displayed an almost organic smoothness, their surface appearing to shift subtly in his peripheral vision. When he tried to focus directly on any particular section, it remained perfectly still, but the moment his attention wandered, that strange, flowing quality returned. Kevin ran his hand along the wall as they walked, his young face creased with concentration. This material, It's not concrete or metal. It feels warm, almost alive. He pulled his hand back suddenly, examining his palm. And it's reading me somehow. I can feel it taking measurements. Indeed, wherever any of them made contact with the walls, faint patterns of light would bloom beneath the surface, spreading like bioluminescent ripples in a disturbed pond. The facility wasn't just housing them, it was studying them, cataloging their presence with every step. Jennifer stayed close to her father, her initial fear giving way to professional curiosity. As a nurse, she'd worked with advanced medical equipment, but nothing that approached the sophistication evident in every aspect of this underground complex. "The air quality," she murmured. "It's perfect. Temperature, humidity, even the pressure feels optimized. This isn't just climate control, it's environmental engineering on a level we don't have today." The corridor began to widen, and Bob noticed something troubling about their path. Despite walking what felt like a straight line, his internal sense of direction insisted they had somehow curved back on themselves multiple times. Yet the passage ahead showed no signs of intersection or overlap. The geometry of the space defied conventional understanding. "Disorientation is normal," the system's voice announced, seeming to come from the walls themselves. "Spatial configuration technology allows maximum utilization of underground volume. Your perception will adjust." They emerged into what the system had called Briefing Room Alpha, but the circular chamber that greeted them bore no resemblance to any military or corporate briefing room Bob had ever seen. The space seemed to breathe, its dimensions subtly expanding and contracting in rhythm with something deeper than mechanical ventilation. The central table wasn't furniture in any traditional sense, but rather a solidified portion of the same flowing material that composed the walls, risen from the floor like a technological mushroom. As they approached, the table's surface rippled and reformed, creating perfectly contoured seating that adjusted to each of their bodies with unnerving precision. Bob felt the chair formation cradle him, supporting his 68-year-old frame in a way that immediately eased the chronic back pain he'd carried for decades. Whatever this material was, it understood human physiology better than any ergonomic designer. The air above the table shimmered, and suddenly they were surrounded by floating images. Not projections in any conventional sense, but three-dimensional constructs that seemed as solid as reality itself. Bob reached out to touch. A photograph of his grandfather standing with a group of scientists, and felt resistance as his fingers met the image. It wasn't a hologram, it was something far more advanced. "William Marcus Walker," the system began, the words appearing as text while simultaneously being spoken, "recruited to Project Greenfield not for his agricultural knowledge, but for his unique cognitive architecture." The phrase cognitive architecture sent a chill down Bob's spine. The image shifted, zooming in on his grandfather's eyes, which suddenly seemed less familiar. There was something different about them, a quality Bob had always attributed to. The graininess of old photographs, but now recognized as something more fundamental. "What do you mean by cognitive architecture?" Jennifer asked, her voice tight with apprehension. The display responded by showing what appeared to be brain scans, but unlike any medical imaging Bob had seen, these revealed structures and patterns that shouldn't exist in human neurology, geometric formations within the brain tissue that resembled crystalline matrices more than organic matter. The Walker lineage carries genetic markers, indicating non-baseline human characteristics. Your grandfather was identified during routine military testing in 1943. His neural patterns showed compatibility with interface protocols beyond current human standard. Kevin leaned forward, his face pale but fascinated. "You're saying great-great-grandpa wasn't entirely human?" "Incorrect," William Walker was fully human. However, approximately 0.3% of the population carries dormant genetic sequences that indicate ancient hybridization events. The Walker line represents one of the strongest expressions of these traits. The implications crashed over Bob like a cold wave. His family wasn't just randomly selected to guard some Cold War agricultural project. They had been chosen because of something in their very DNA, something that set them apart from baseline humanity. The display shifted to show a timeline stretching back not decades, but millennia. Points of light marked significant events, and as the system narrated, Bob felt the foundation of his understanding of human history beginning to crack. 12,000 years ago, during the period your historians call the Younger Dryas, Earth experienced intervention. The details remain classified beyond your current clearance, but the result was the introduction of genetic material designed to remain dormant until specific evolutionary conditions were met. Jennifer gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Intervention by whom? That information requires higher authorization. What you need to understand is that Project Greenfield was not initiated in 1958. It was activated in 1958. The project itself has been dormant within human genetic structure for millennia, waiting for the correct technological and social conditions. The room seemed to spin slightly, and Bob realized it wasn't vertigo. The chamber was actually rotating, aligning itself with something deep beneath them. Through the transparent floor, he could see additional levels descending into darkness, each one larger than the last, defying any reasonable estimate of how such a structure could exist undetected. The agricultural crisis your world faces is not accidental, the system continued. It is a trigger condition. When a species reaches the point where its population exceeds its ability to feed itself through conventional means, intervention protocols activate. New images filled the air around them, not just photographs, but memories, somehow extracted and displayed. Bob saw his father, James Walker, as a young man, standing in this very room. But the date stamp showed 1952, a full decade before the facility was supposedly built. Each generation of Walkers has been tested. Most remain unaware, their memories adjusted to maintain operational security. James Walker chose to retain partial awareness, believing it would better prepare his son. You, Robert, were tested at age 12. You chose complete memory suppression. Bob's head snapped up. I was here before as a child. The display showed him, unmistakably him, though decades younger, standing in a chamber filled with impossible machinery, his hand placed on a surface similar to the scanner above. His 12-year-old face showed not fear, but understanding. And as Bob watched, his younger self spoke words that chilled him. I choose to forget, but I promise to remember when the time comes. The time has come, the system announced. Memory blocks are releasing. Prepare for full cognitive integration. Before Bob could protest or even fully process what was happening, the chair beneath him shifted, extruding tendrils that attached to his temples with surprising gentleness. His vision exploded with images, memories flooding back like a dam bursting in his mind. He was 12 again, brought here by his father on what he'd thought was a camping trip. The underground facility had been smaller then, or perhaps his child's perspective had simply perceived less of its true scope. He remembered the tests, not academic or physical, but something that evaluated his consciousness itself. Machines that could read not just thoughts, but the underlying structure of awareness. Beings that weren't quite human, directing the procedures, their forms shifting in ways that normal matter shouldn't allow. And above all, he remembered the choice. Carry the burden of knowledge through life, or live normally until the appointed time. His younger self had chosen wisely, recognizing that The weight of such secrets would crush a child's normal development. But now, as the memories integrated with his current consciousness, Bob understood the full scope of what his family had been guarding. The agricultural technology was real. The crops that could grow in any condition, the solutions to world hunger, all of it waited in the levels below. But it was merely the surface layer, a cover story for something far more profound. The true purpose of the Walker guardianship wasn't to protect advanced farming techniques. It was to serve as a bridge between humanity and its hidden heritage. "Dad?" Jennifer's voice seemed to come from very far away. Bob opened his eyes. When had he closed them? To find his daughter and grandson staring at him with concern. How long had he been under? The chair released him, and he sat up, his mind reeling with integrated memories. "I remember," he said simply. "I remember everything." The briefing room dissolved around them, walls flowing like liquid to reveal a much larger space. They stood, now in what could only be described as a cathedral of technology, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows hundreds of feet above. Massive columns that pulsed with internal light supported the structure, and between them, Bob could see row upon row of what looked like cultivation chambers. But these weren't growing plants. Each chamber contained something that defied classification, organisms that seemed part biological, part technological, part something else entirely. They moved with purpose, tending to tasks incomprehensible, to baseline human understanding. "The agricultural innovations are real," the system explained, responding to Bob's thoughts. "But they are byproducts of a larger process. Your species stands at a threshold. The choice before you is not whether to release advanced farming technology, but whether humanity is ready for reintegration with its forgotten heritage." Kevin stepped forward, his young face showing remarkable composure. "Reintegration with what? Who are we really? What are we?" The answer came not from the system, but from a new presence in the chamber. The air shimmered, and three figures materialized. Humanoid, but clearly not human. Their forms seemed stable at first glance, but Bob's restored memories recognized the subtle fluctuations that revealed their true nature. These were the same beings he'd encountered as a child, the ones his mind had been protected from fully comprehending until now. "You are our children," one of them spoke, though its mouth didn't move in sync with the words. The voice carried harmonics that resonated in Bob's bones. 12,000 years ago, we seeded your species with potential, not to control, but to preserve. Your planet faced catastrophe, and pure humanity would not have survived. We gave you dormant gifts, locked away until you developed the wisdom to use them." Jennifer stumbled backward, but the beings made no move toward them. Their presence was overwhelming but not threatening, like standing before a force of nature rather than individuals. "The agricultural crisis is real," the entity continued. "Your world cannot sustain its current trajectory, but the solutions we offer require evolution, not just of your technology, but of your consciousness itself. The choice is whether humanity embraces its hybrid heritage or continues as a limited species facing inevitable collapse." Bob found his voice, drawing on both his human stubbornness and whatever else flowed in his veins. "Why us? Why the Walkers?" "Because your line carries the strongest expression of the interface genes. You can serve as translators between what humanity is and what it must become. Others around the world are awakening to similar roles. Farming families, indigenous communities, bloodlines that maintained connection to the earth. The Walker guardianship is one node in a global network of evolution." The chamber shifted again, walls becoming transparent to reveal the true scope of the underground complex. It extended for miles in every direction, a hidden city of impossibilities. But more than that, Bob could sense connections, tunnels of energy linking this place to similar facilities worldwide, a nervous system for a planet preparing to transform. "Show them the cultivation chambers," another entity suggested, its form rippling with what might have been amusement. "Let them see what their grandfather truly protected." A platform materialized beneath their feet, lifting them smoothly through the air. They soared between the massive columns, approaching the chambers Bob had glimpsed from below. As they drew closer, the contents became clearer, and Jennifer gasped. Inside each chamber grew not just plants, but entire ecosystems. Self-contained worlds where the boundaries between flora, fauna, and technology had dissolved. Trees with crystalline fruit that pulsed with internal light. Vines that moved with animal-like purpose, tending to their environment. Flowers that sang in harmonics that could restructure matter at the molecular level. "These are templates," their guide explained. "Biological systems designed to terraform not just your planet, but your species. Each one represents a different path forward, a different balance between human heritage and enhanced capability. The Walker family must help humanity choose which path to take." They descended into a grove of the impossible trees, their fruit casting rainbow patterns on the ground. Bob reached out to touch one, and knowledge flowed into him. Not words or images, but direct understanding. This particular fruit could rewrite human digestion, allowing people to photosynthesize like plants, to draw energy directly from sunlight. Hunger would become obsolete, but humanity would also become something new. "Every solution changes you," the entity observed. "This is why the choice cannot be rushed. Your grandfather understood this. He spent years studying the options, preparing the groundwork for this moment. Now the decision falls to you." Kevin had wandered to another section, where vines wove through the air in complex patterns. As he watched, they began spelling out words, responding to his presence. "These are conscious," he said in wonder. "They're trying to communicate." "Everything here represents a merger of consciousness and matter," their guide confirmed. "Your current binary distinction between organic and artificial, between thinking and non-thinking, these are limitations that must be transcended. But the question remains, how much change can humanity accept while still remaining human?" Bob felt the weight of generations pressing on him. His grandfather had established this guardianship, his father had maintained it, and now the culmination of their vigilance had arrived. The foreclosure notice that had driven him to plow the North Field seemed laughably insignificant compared to the choice before them. "What happens if we say no?" Jennifer asked. "If humanity chooses to remain as we are?" The entity's form darkened. "Then you face the standard curve of planetary civilizations. Resource depletion, ecological collapse, potential extinction. We have watched countless worlds make this choice. Some survive through brutal adaptation, becoming harder, more violent, ultimately losing what made them worth preserving. Others simply end. And if we say yes, then humanity begins its true journey. The agricultural technology you discovered is the gentlest introduction. Enhanced crops that solve immediate problems while subtly preparing human biology for larger changes. Each innovation builds on the last, a stairway to transcendence. Taken one manageable step at a time, they were shown more chambers, each one representing a different aspect of the transformation. Medical technologies that could eliminate disease, but would also activate dormant genetic sequences. Energy systems that tapped into planetary consciousness but required humans to develop new sensory organs to manage them. Transportation methods that folded space but demanded minds capable of nonlinear thinking. "It's too much," Jennifer whispered. "How can we decide the future of our entire species?" "You don't," The entity replied gently. You decide whether to open the door. Humanity, as a whole, will determine how far to walk through it. Your role is to be guides, to help others understand the choices, to serve as bridges between the familiar and the impossible. They returned to the briefing room, but it had transformed into something more like a command center. Displays showed real-time data from around the globe, environmental degradation, agricultural yields, population growth, conflict zones. The trends all pointed toward imminent crisis. The tipping point approaches, the system announced. Current projections indicate global food system collapse within 18 months without intervention. Decision time is limited. Bob stood before the central console, his hand hovering over the activation panel. 3 generations of walkers stood together, facing a choice that would ripple through time. The beings watched silently, their presence supportive but not compelling. This decision had to be made freely, with full understanding of its implications. I need to know one thing, Bob said, turning to face the entities. Are we still human if we do this? Or do we become something else entirely? The lead entity's form shifted, becoming more human-like, more relatable. You become what you were always meant to be. The human spirit, your creativity, your compassion, your stubborn independence, these remain. But your capabilities expand. You gain the tools to match your aspirations. The farmer's son becomes the shepherd of worlds. Kevin stepped forward, placing his young hand on his grandfather's shoulder. The world's dying, Grandpa. We can't keep pretending everything's fine. Whatever we become, it has to be better than watching everything collapse. Jennifer nodded slowly. And we don't have to force anything on anyone. We're just opening possibilities, right? Showing people there's another way. Bob thought of his neighbors. Good people who'd lost their farms to corporate agriculture. He thought of the droughts, the floods, the increasingly desperate measures needed to feed the world's billions. He thought of his grandfather, who'd guarded this secret for decades, waiting for the right moment. The foreclosure was never about money, he realized aloud. It was about forcing this choice. Correct, the entity confirmed. Economic pressure was deemed the most ethical way to trigger the Revelation Protocol. You needed to feel the desperation your species faces as a whole. Only from that understanding could you make an informed choice. Bob looked at his family, his daughter, the healer, and his grandson, the bridge to future generations. He saw in their eyes the same mixture of fear and hope that churned in his own heart. Whatever they decided here would echo through generations. But perhaps that had always been the burden of the Walker line. He placed his palm on the console. The effect was immediate, but not violent. The chamber filled with a harmonious tone that seemed to vibrate through every cell in their bodies. Displays showed activation sequences triggering at similar facilities around the world. In the Amazon, hidden beneath ancient temples. In Siberia, where nomadic tribes had guarded sacred grounds for millennia. In the Australian outback, where Aboriginal songlines converged on spots of power. Global Awakening Protocol initiated, the system announced. Phase 1, Agricultural Enhancement Distribution beginning. Estimated time to public awareness, 72 hours. The entities began to fade, their forms becoming translucent. Our direct involvement ends here, the lead being explained. What comes next must be navigated by humanity itself, but you will not be alone. The Walker line and others like you will serve as guides. The attributes sleeping in your genetics will awaken gradually, giving you the abilities needed to help your species through the transition. As they disappeared entirely, leaving only the 3 walkers in the now normal-seeming briefing room, the entity's final words echoed in the air. Remember, every ending is a beginning. What seems like change is really just remembering who you always were. The facility began its transformation, walls reconfiguring to create access points that would soon welcome scientists, officials, and eventually the public. The agricultural innovations, the cover story that was also truth, would emerge first, solving immediate crises while preparing humanity for deeper changes. Bob led his family back through the corridors, which no longer seemed alien, but almost welcoming. As they climbed the stairs to the surface, he felt a strange sensation in his mind, new perceptions awakening, dormant neural pathways firing for the first time. The others were experiencing it too. He could sense their minds, like lights in the darkness, connected by threads of consciousness that had always been there but were only now becoming active. They emerged into the Kansas morning to find the farm transformed. The metal door stood open, but around it, the earth had reformed into an elegant entrance structure. The wheat in the north field grew visibly, reaching toward the sun with renewed vigor. In the distance, vehicles were already approaching, the first wave of officials responding to the activation protocol. "What have we done?" Jennifer asked, but her tone carried wonder rather than regret. "We've opened a door," Bob replied, feeling the truth of it in his bones. "Where it leads is up to all of us." The sun climbed higher, casting light on a world that had changed fundamentally in the space of a morning. The Walker farm, which had faced its final harvest, had instead become the seedbed for humanity's transformation. The foreclosure notices, the corporate pressure, the decades of struggle, all of it had been orchestrated to bring them to this moment, this choice, this new beginning. As government helicopters appeared on the horizon, Bob felt a strange peace settle over him. His grandfather's burden had been passed down and finally fulfilled. The secret was a secret no more, and humanity would face its challenges with tools it had never imagined. Tools that had been sleeping in its very DNA, waiting for the moment when the species was ready to remember its true heritage. The last harvest had ended. The first planting of humanity's hybrid future had begun, and the Walkers, simple farmers who had found themselves guardians of impossible secrets, stood ready to help their species navigate the transformation ahead. The morning sun painted the Kansas fields gold, but Bob could see beyond the visible spectrum now, perceiving the energy networks that connected every living thing. The change had begun, and there was no going back. But perhaps there never had been. Perhaps this had always been humanity's destination, encoded in its genes from the very beginning, waiting for the moment when the species would face the choice between transformation and extinction. The Walkers had simply been the key that unlocked the door, and now all of humanity would decide how far to walk through it. The adventure was just beginning, and Bob Walker, standing in his wheat field as helicopters circled overhead, felt the weight of history balanced against the promise of an unimaginable future. Whatever came next, humanity would face it with capabilities it had only dreamed of, and with the Walker family serving as guides between the world that was ending and the one being born. In the distance, more vehicles approached, and Bob could sense the minds within them. Scientists, officials, journalists, all drawn by the activation protocol to witness the beginning of humanity's next chapter. The quiet Kansas farm would never be quiet again, but that seemed a small price to pay for the role it would play in species evolution. The metal door in the north field stood open, an invitation to transformation that could no longer be ignored. And as the first officials stepped out of their vehicles, Bob Walker prepared to introduce them to wonders that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human potential, agricultural science, and the true history of life on Earth. The morning stretched ahead, pregnant with possibility, as 3 generations of Walkers stood ready to shepherd humanity through its metamorphosis. The foreclosure crisis that had threatened to end their legacy had instead triggered its true purpose. The last harvest was complete. The first planting of the hybrid future had begun, and in the depths below their feet, impossible ecosystems waited to transform not just how humanity fed itself, but what it meant to be human at all. The choice had been made. The door stood open. The future, whatever form it would take, had arrived on a small farm in Kansas, carried in the genes of a family who had guarded secrets older than civilization itself. The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the monumentous changes below, as humanity began its journey toward a destiny written in its DNA 12,000 years before. The walkers had played their part, unlocking the door to transformation. Now came the harder task, helping their species walk through it without losing the essence of what made them human, while gaining the capabilities needed to survive and thrive in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. The last morning of the old world faded into the first afternoon of the new, and Bob Walker, simple farmer turned shepherd of evolution, stood ready to guide humanity. Home to a heritage it had forgotten it possessed, the harvest was complete. The planting had begun, and the future, terrible and magnificent in its potential, beckoned to a species finally ready to embrace its true nature. The story of the walkers and their secret burden had ended. The story of humanity's transformation had just begun. And somewhere in the space between ending and beginning, in that liminal moment when everything changes, 3 generations of a farming family stood as bridges between worlds, ready to help their species navigate the greatest transition in human history. The metal door remained open, a portal between eras, as the quiet Kansas morning gave way to a future that would echo through the stars themselves. The walkers had made their choice. Now humanity would make its own. One person, one decision, one transformed consciousness at a time. And in the depths of the earth, wonders waited to reshape not just agriculture, but the very definition of life itself, as a species stood on the threshold of remembering who it had always been meant to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.